Excellent. Let's just give it a few more minutes, a couple of minutes for people to join. It's great to see you, Tim, although it's not live. It doesn't feel like live. It's the best we can do.
Well, we know each other well enough that it feels like it's in person.
Exactly.
Always better in person.
All right, so let's get started. First of all, thanks for everyone who's joining this conversation. Perhaps you've joined other conversations that we've been having recently on race, a number of different topics, and a call to action. I've been so fortunate to have in my circle thought leaders from across many different arenas, and I would say that Tim is one of those people who I've gotten to know over the years, who has become quite a friend and ally and a leader that I really respect. Tim and I first met years ago when I was head of people at Goldman Sachs. I got a reach out from one of our best investment banking colleagues who was very interested in, Tim apparently was very interested in talking about human capital at Goldman. I thought it would be the typical 15 minutes with the CEO, spend the rest of the time with the team. In reality, I think, what was it, Tim? 2 hours later, we were still there. And that was the beginning of a very active dialogue with Tim. And so it's really a thrill to have you join our conversation today. Tim has done a number of amazing things in his career. I'm just going to leave it to you, Tim. What would you like to highlight for this community?
Yeah, well, first, Edith, it's been an amazing relationship that we've had over the years. And I think it's unusual to get interviewed by you, because usually I'm torturing you for a question. I would just say that I think I think you hit on a couple of things already, which are really important. I think, having been a public company CEO and really worked in the internet space for the last 25 years, both starting companies, managing companies. I was at Google, I did AOL, I was at Paul Allen's first internet company, Starwave, and now and then was at Verizon on the executive team for a few years, and then started a new company called DTX, which is in the direct-to-consumer space. So I've had a pretty wide variety, from startups to Fortune 20 companies, being on the exec teams and leading some of them. I would just say, I think the couple things you hit on, Edith. One is, I think you embody, from a judgment standpoint, I think judgment's the rare skill set, to have in the world. And the reason I got in touch with you is because I was asking people, hey, I need to work, we're trying to work on a whole bunch of people innovations. Who's the best person in any industry who's has excellent judgment and really thinks about people in a different way? And that's how your name came up, and that's how we got connected. So it wasn't any preordained thing. It was me just asking questions about who's the best person in the world is, and your name came up multiple times. And that's when I went down to see you. And I think the second thing, you having been at Goldman Sachs and now doing Medley, is the thing I saw from you at Goldman Sachs, which was inspiring and really kind of the people journey that I've been on, like thinking about people, is the self-empowerment and the ability for people to basically, as much as corporations help people or institutions help people, people being able to help themselves and go into self-education and self-learning and really discovery process. I think the business that you're doing today, Medley, is going to have a big impact on that. So I would just say also, the last thing maybe is just, career advice I got early on was have a personal board of directors. And Edith's on my personal board of directors, and I have a number of other people that even Edith and I are now mutual friends with on that personal board. But I think in this situation we're discussing today, both self-education and having the ability to talk to people and really navigate what your thoughts are is an important element to that. And I think, Edith, you're one of the best people in the world. I've said that to you privately. So I'm not saying that because we're on video together. It's what I sincerely.
Oh, no, it's nice to hear on video, I have to say. Thank you. And the only awkward thing about this is that we have to announce at the beginning of our conversations whose turn it is to be an advisee versus an advisor.
Exactly.
And that's where great relationships really continue to grow. Let's just get right into it, because there's so much experience that you've had in the circles that you travel in over 25 years in growth companies, creating new categories and opportunities. And this is an extraordinary time. We were chatting, as we always do, about things that are going on in the environment and how they feel to us as individuals, but in the communities. This is an incredible time for all of our communities to come together to understand the significance of having conversations about race, but moving those conversations to real action. Tell us about some of the conversations that you're having in your circles, and they are many: CEOs, leadership of philanthropic organizations, et cetera. Like when, quite frankly, to be blunt, when Black people are not in the room, what are you talking about?
Yeah, so my experience on this, spans from small intimate meetings with CEOs, 5 or 6 at a time, to large group settings where there's probably 40, 50, 60 people like that, maybe 100. I'm the chairman of a school in Greenwich, Connecticut that's been on kind of forefront of this. And then I'm on a couple, public and private corporate boards where this has come up, also. And I would just say, Edith, when Black people are not in the room, I would say I've seen the following things. Number one is, I think there's, on the positive side, there's real energy and commitment. I think that, like, this feels differently than situations have been in the past around this topic. And I believe there's, like, true leaders emerging at all these different institutions I'm involved in who will actually improve things. So at a positive side, I think that's true. The second thing I would say is that, like, people are committed to change their personal views. I've seen more.
That's really interesting. Why is that so? I sense that too. Tell us about that. Yeah.
I think the personal view side of it, Edith, is, I think this situation has forced people. A lot of the situations in the past have been like, what are we doing as an organization? This one is so big and feels so personal that people have actually had to self-reflect. And I've seen this from a lot of leaders on, like, what is the definition of my view? I talked to the CEO and founder of a company last night who called to talk about this. And the person had, like, in 5 minutes on the phone with me, somebody I've known for a long time, kind of rattled off everything the person had personally read, who they've spoken to, all that. And then they were comparing their experience versus other leaders and why they have woken up to some things that they thought differently in the past. And I just think that you didn't have those conversations before. So I think there's a lot of self-education going on, which is really good. So I think those are the positives in this, which is the energy level's high enough where things are going to change, I believe. And there's reflection, deep reflection on a personal level where it used to be organizational for people. And that's super important. The areas where I think that, like, the areas that are probably, like, more constructive, or things that I see as kind of negative, I think one is how fast this movement's happened. I think for some older generations, they're like, whoa, wait,
Right.
let's not go too quickly. And I've seen this in multiple instances. And, at least my personal feedback on this is, like, look, this isn't built for you. Like, if this is going too quickly to some degree, that's either a signal that maybe it's going too quickly, but I don't think it is. It may be that your viewpoint is too historical and too old at looking at this. And, like, especially the situations I see with the younger people at work and in the school I'm involved in. I'm older now, but I would say this is about the kid. This is about the next generation. If you think about where the world's going to be in 5 or 10 years, that's what you're organizing towards. You're not organizing for 1985. You're organizing for 2035. And I think that organizations and leaders are going to have to be okay with letting some ships sail. And you're not going to convert everybody, and you're going to have to be okay with that. And you're going to get negative feedback that you're moving too quickly. But I look at it as a fait accompli. Like, why wouldn't you bend towards the arc of whatever that saying is, the arc of justice in the universe always bends towards justice. And why not bend? And I just think that's one. I think the second thing is, like, I will say this: I've seen non-Black people be very vocal about wanting to do things and getting involved, and they have real opinions on it. And then when a Black person comes in the room, they turn into mummies. And I think there's a mummy problem. And I saw this in one meeting I was in, where I spoke to a number of the people that were going to be on this call we did, and then there were Black people on the call, and the white people didn't speak. And one of the Black people said, "Hey, your silence is deafening. Right. You're not speaking up." And so here you have the worst dynamic, which is the Black people on the call were expressing feelings. The white people weren't really saying much. And even though I knew privately the white people agreed and would want to pile on, they just got so scared of saying anything wrong that they didn't say anything. And then that turned into its own dynamic And I think if you're a white person or non-black person, like, I would say it's better to speak up than it is to be careful. Even if you say the wrong thing, I think not saying anything comes across as almost worse than saying the wrong thing. And I don't know if you agree with that, Edith, but that.
Yeah, I totally do. Let me just make a couple of comments. First of all, as I would have expected, you're being very honest and open, and that's what has to happen. We have to have these conversations where we're talking about white people and we're talking about black people and the way that we're interacting or not, because we're not going to move forward unless we get comfortable with that. I do hear what you're saying about non-black people's hesitancy of having conversations in the presence of black people. I would encourage all of us to, despite what we believe as black people as things that have been obvious for generations, to understand the challenges of stepping outside of your typical lane and having these conversations and encouraging people to speak, even though the language might not be perfect. I had, a conversation, earlier this week where someone said, I just have to ask you, is it okay to say black? Is it okay to say African American? What do I say? I don't want to say the wrong thing. And similarly to what you advised, let's just talk through it. Let me tell you about the history of black. Let me tell you the history of African American. And here's some things to read. And so I think these conversations are really critically important. I would also say, honestly, that part of the issue that we have is when you're not interacting with people outside of your lane, any conversation is hard.
Yeah.
Right? So if you are a senior leader, or quite frankly, young people are now experiencing this epiphany that, oh my goodness, I really care about social justice, but when I look at my inner circle, we're all the same.
Yeah.
Help me get out of this. So perhaps we should also think about, we're in this moment of the difficult, let's think about the interactions that we all have as individuals on anything.
Yeah.
How about start with the job that you're doing? How about start with the weather? How about start with whatever you're comfortable with so that you can start to build these relationships? How do you, going back to something else you said, Tim, you talked about the difference in the conversations on race and on the Black experience, and that we're in this incredible learning curve. How do we then start to pivot to making sure we don't blow this opportunity for substantive change going forward?
Yeah, I think one is, I think there's two things. One, it requires people to understand what it feels like to be a minority and being a minority in situations. So like, I'll give you just, I'm into super logistical, like trying things. So when I was running AOL, for instance, I created a rule, which was you couldn't have a meeting without minority class at the meeting. And I would cancel meetings. So if the meeting was not diverse, I would just cancel the meeting. So it did a couple things. It required new people to show up to meetings. And what happened was it built relationships. So what started from not being, in the club, all of a sudden all these new people were in these meetings and people started to build relationships. So like you go out 3 or 4 months after that, and like all of a sudden all this new fabric of community was built just because people spent time with people. I'd say the second one I got haphazardly, Edith, was I was at AOL, we started Makers and Built by Girls, which were two women's leadership areas. And I used to go to Makers events where I was the only male there. And I remember going to DVF's apartment one time. She held a Makers event. And I remember the elevator door opening up and it was 100% women. And I was the only man there. And my stomach dropped. I mean, here I am, public company CEO, been successful, have to go and speak at 1,000 different things, interact in all kinds of different rooms with different people. When I was the only one at those events, I was zero confidence, didn't want to speak. Even if I had a strong opinion about something, at first I wouldn't say it. I got into groups of people talking. They were talking about stuff. I had no idea what they were talking about. And so that was like, for me, a super shocking experience. And it happened to me multiple times where I would go to these events for Makers and be the only man in the room. But it changed my viewpoint when I would go to other meetings and there'd only be one of somebody in another room.
Right.
Because I'd sit there and think, wow, I wonder if that person felt like I did at the Makers event right now. Like that person might have the best product idea or tech idea or HR idea, but they're probably not going to speak up. And so I think there's like that element, Edith, of like, it would be a waste if we go through this experience and business leaders, and again, that me saying meetings are going to get canceled without having a minority class in the room, that may be totally wrong, but I feel like at least I tried, and at least I saw the output was positive in terms of building the fabric of what allowed people to operate in a new community. And I just wonder, like, if every leader in the country who runs a business or institution or a school or not-for-profit wrote down one thing they would do, just one. And again, I'll go back to the COVID thing. Is like, I probably sat in 5 or 6 different company boardrooms around COVID planning, and it was like lightning in a bottle. COVID hit, they had experts, they had changes, they did meal plans, they did who's sitting where, what's travel policy. And and then when Black Lives Matter came up, I sat in some of those rooms and they were like, what do we do? What and I said, hey, we just sat through 3 weeks of COVID planning where no one had any questions and no one dealt with COVID before. Why isn't there a Black Lives Matter plan that matches what we just did on COVID? And by the way, why can't you think about it? And you and I talked about this on the phone, but everyone's initial reaction was, let's call somebody who's Black and ask them what to do. And I was like, don't call somebody who's, first of all, you're probably adding a major amount of emotional burden onto those people. But 2 is, when COVID hit, we didn't immediately pick up the phone and start calling COVID people. We really sat down and like studied COVID, figured out what we could do, and talked to people and create a whole network around it. Just do the same thing with Black Lives Matter. And I think that lesson of just get started is really big in this category.
Yeah, there's so many things that we could dig in on there, and that just make a couple of observations. First of all, you did mention that we as Black people have been very consumed by the learning curve that's required. And someone asked me, I refer to it as a burden, and I don't feel that way. And I think I speak for many, that in fact, it's great to be seen.
Yeah.
It's great to be heard. And it's great that it's being recognized that our experiences are unique and are important and are the foundation of what has built this country. And so if it takes, if this is the topic that we're being called to speak about, we are eager and we are engaged, not only to talk about our personal experiences, but to give history lessons from time to time. But one of the things that you've mentioned or inferred is how important that people do their own learning. We have a comment from Leah Johnson here. How do we get white people leaders to know and understand their own privilege and race? Step 1 is to understand what it is in this country to be white.
Yeah,
that's a learning point. That's a learning point. Like, understand that it's not a natural state that didn't have interventions that have led to the situation that we are in. And do your homework every time you have a conversation with someone of color, Black person, realize where your gaps are. Someone said, Google is a powerful thing. Get on there, start learning. And that's really important, because that's the return on everything we are offering and everything we are willing to give. I also think that it was really important for you to note that you have taken intentional action, that you recognize, and we all have to recognize, when you are in the room with the same, you will not get the best outcome. And if it takes that awkward, I'm not having this meeting, I think that's a very interesting idea. Yeah. I think it's an interesting idea that will get people to think about who they're surrounding themselves with and take actions to evolve that. Tell us about, this world of investment and evaluation of opportunity, particularly in, the venture capital world, where money flows, investments in people effectively. What do we need to do to open that lens of investors to understand the extraordinary opportunities that exist and tapping into the Black community for now and for the future?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things, Edith. One is, your background at Goldman, which I think is, the best and biggest financial institution in the world. I think that when you think about it, a lot of the major things that get done in the world get done on not cash capital, but relationship capital. And I think one thing is like actually opening up venues where those relationships and the ideas can get shared and built. And, just in full disclosure, your son, Daniel, and I work together, and he's been working on a project to kind of open up the venture capital community for Black funding of ideas. And I think that the first step is basically to get the ideas surfaced. I think that's numero uno, and then have the relationships into the money pockets. I mean, I know that I've used Goldman for this in the past. Like, I would call Goldman Sachs to get money, not from Goldman Sachs, but because I knew Goldman had a relationship with somebody that I wanted money from. And so because I was kind of in the club, I could pick up the phone, call, get to somebody, get a meeting, get funding, or, because I spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley on the venture side, running companies and doing investments, I could pretty much call anybody and get in. And I think on the Black VC side, that network needs to be built, Edith. And I think that, that really starts, I think, with relationship capital and having infrastructure behind being able to get ideas out into the world. So I think you're going to see, incubators pop out of this. I think you're going to see VC firms specialize in this. I think you're going to see, major corporations with VCs start to focus in on this. And I'll give you just one other example of something that we tried when I was running AOL. Is we did a thing called Infuse 100, where instead of normally hiring interns, we went after diverse interns from low income areas across the US. And there were kids from really good colleges, but most of the kids were from high schools. And the amount of product development that got done that summer was amazing, because the idea influx of the diversity of the ideas that came in also. And I think you go to Silicon Valley, I shouldn't say this because I've benefited greatly from Silicon Valley, but Silicon Valley is one of the least diverse places. And I think that lack of diversity over time leads to a lack of, interesting, probably what could be more groundbreaking ideas. I think there's been really successful companies, but nobody talks about the 99% of companies that don't work. And I think the diversity of thought that would come out of a more inclusive venture capital community around this will be really big.
I totally agree with that. The venture capital is all about finding the next great idea. And if you have defined your next great idea as being similar to the previous 10 ideas, but the great news is there's a lot of opportunity out there to capture that untapped universe. I saw, I think I've mentioned this before, I saw a review in some media post around the best pitches that they've seen, and all the pitches were for men, all the pitches were for similar software products, and all of the sort of rap was similar. I walked away first thinking, like, seriously, this is 2020, like, let's get our act together. But then I walked away saying, all right, there's a lot of opportunity out there that nobody's paying attention to. And the wonderful thing that I think we are in a better but not strong position, we're going to get to strong very quickly, is that people are realizing that so much excellence, economic growth, opportunity is driven by the Black community and people of color. And so if you're not close to that understanding of the experience, of the way we spend money, of how we prioritize things, of the opportunities, you're going to be missing out. So I think that's really important. I would love to just encourage people to put up questions, and I will ask them directly to Tim. Can we talk a little bit about the work that needs to be done to permanently shift the leadership at companies? One of the things I hear that kind of makes me a little bit crazy is we want to hire more senior people, but we don't want to lower the bar. Yeah. I personally have never heard anyone reference hiring a white person and say we want to hire a great person, but we don't want to lower the bar. Yeah. And so what can you do? What have you done? You mentioned making sure that there are more Black people in meetings. But why are we at the point that there's no Black people in meeting? And how do we make sure in 2-3 years' time that that's different? What are your thoughts on that?
I'll give you another logistic thing we did, or executional thing we did at my new company is, I think this problem, Edith, is the most broken problem, because I think most companies have a super high failure rate of hiring executives. And so at my new company, we went with a data first approach, which was we mapped the team data, and then we mapped what skill sets we wanted as a business, and we hired from there. And we've ended up with the most diverse, team I've ever had. And it's because we basically just went purely for skills testing and skills data. And I think that if you did all of your hiring and executive hiring where you started with data that was colorblind, you'd end up with a more diverse team. And this was like, we didn't start with that intention, but that's what's happened at DTX. And so I think that is definitely numero uno, which is, skill sets, and the data behind skill sets will find diversity because they're skill set based, not because of any other reason. I think that's really powerful. I think the second thing actually is like the ability to have a network that's a diverse network. So if you start off in a non-diverse network, you're going to end up in a non-diverse, outcome. So it's like
exactly
math, So I just think if you went to leaders and you asked them how many people they interface with who are Black, just interface with, just you talk to, you're friends with, all those other things. If the answer is 0, the chance that you're going to go out and find and hire someone who is Black is probably really low. If you have a network of business people that are diverse, and some are Black, and you're connected to them, and you can pick the phone up and call them or find out who the best people, like when I got to you, Edith, I didn't say, who's the best Black HR people capital manager in the country? I said, who's the best person in the country who does the most high-skilled hiring, development, training, who's put the most engineers to work? And by the way, Edith Cooper. I had no idea who you were. And when I showed up, you were Black. But I'm like, I didn't start with the fact that I want to meet Edith because she's Black and talented. I wanted to meet you. I was like, let's find the best person. And I think but you were in my network, meaning that I could call people to find out who the best person was. So if you don't have a network that has diversity in it, you're not going to find diversity, I think.
Right. And therefore, it is very important for all of us to make sure we are stepping out of our natural networks and exploring, people and seeking out people that are not currently included. And so therefore, there was a great intersection between, our organizations that gave us an opportunity to get to know each other. But there is, and we're seeing that right now also, it's not a bad thing to say, I don't know any Black people who are in my community. I'm going to find some, because I am not going to be as relevant as a leader or as impactful as a human being if I continue to repeat the patterns of staying in my comfort zone. And so I think we all have to do that. I had an opportunity to join the board of Slack and Etsy, 2 great companies. Yes, I had a strong resume that led that to me, but the reason I got to know them was because I said, I don't know a lot about growth companies. I don't know a lot about software. I don't know a lot about what's going on in Silicon Valley. I'm going to figure out how to put myself in that uncomfortable conversation to learn more. And the question that we all have to ask ourselves is, we have the resumes, we have the experience. How do we make sure that people of color, Black people specifically, have access to getting into those networks? I promised actually that we would take some specific questions, and we have one here from Joseph Williams on diverse VCs. And the question specifically is, how can VC and organizations hold each other more accountable to ensure greater commitment to diverse representation?
All right. I'd say on this one, Edith, and you have as much or more experience than I do about how do you move the needle on things. I'd say the following, which is, if you were a VC and you announced a pool of capital that was meant for Black entrepreneurs, I think you would get an influx of Black entrepreneurs. So let's just say you have a venture capital fund and it's got $100 million in it. If you said 15 or 20 million of that was for Black entrepreneurs, and I think you get a massive influx of deal flow. And so, without, you can still run your business with best ideas win, but if you're not getting the best Black ideas, you're not getting the best ideas. So I think setting something that you publicly disclose of what you're setting aside for this or what you're integrating into your business model, but if you announce it, they will come. And I think that for the venture community, instead of just saying you want to be more diverse, I go back to about 7 years ago. I went to all the rubber chicken dinners in New York Cities for charities, and I have been involved in tons of different, charities, especially in diversity. But like 7 years ago, Edith, I decided to just go for action-based things, and that's pretty much what I've been doing. And I would say the one thing in the white community that people don't do is they'll make statements about diversity. But like, if you just make just make one commitment. If you're a VC, announce 10% of your funding or 20% of your funding is going to go to Black entrepreneurs or Black ideas. I think you'll be inundated with, like, just make the announcement though.
Yeah, I think that's really critical, being very committed. And it has been wonderful to see CEOs that have stepped up on behalf of their companies to declare economic commitments to organizations that are so important, that are really going to change the forward, whether that's NAACP Legal Defense Fund. I'm very supportive there. I'm also very supportive of the African American History Museum and Culture at Smithsonian, because it's about learning. But there are many, and it is wonderful to see all organizations and many individuals step up the giving. I'd like to also see that translate into the specific actions that are required within organizations as well. I really like the transparency, the clarity around 10% of this fund is going to be invested in Black businesses. Not $10 million, not $20 million, 10% of the next fund. Very powerful. Organizations that step up and say, we are going to get to X% of Black people in our most senior ranks. I really like that. It's not we're going to try, it's going to take time, etc. Make a statement, go for it, just like you drive your business. We've got a lot of comments about the significance of leadership, and there's several leaders and organizations that have been highlighted. Ken Chenault, an incredible leader, an important mentor to me and to so many others. Someone mentioned
he's very love Ken. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and an example of a person who is a CEO of a very important company, a Black person who always leveraged his seat and his access for the benefit of others. And I have, and so many others have benefited from that. And also someone who spoke truth.
Yeah.
And I recall at Goldman, we had Ken come in, and there was a lot of hand wringing. He was a CEO, the CEO wanted to talk to him. And it was all this kind of the other. And he just got up there and said, it's hard being a Black person. But I was a lot of time thinking about that. Let's talk about the significant things that I think have made the experience of being a person of color more challenging, and the things that we can do going forward. We've got an Ursula Burns shout out. We've got schools on here that have been mentioned, Florida A&M School of Business. And I think everyone's sharing, because the point is that the knowledge is there, the talent is there. We just have to figure out how to get at it, how to get the majority to really see the excitement and opportunity. So give us some advice, Tim. And I know you're not quick to do that, because you're a taker of advice, which is great. Like, you're always learning, you're a lifelong learner. But for those of us on the call who are in a position where we're getting called upon every day to talk about our experiences, what advice would you give us in those conversations to make sure that that's not the first conversation and the last conversation we have as Black people?
One is what does the person want to accomplish out of it? So I think one of the things that I've heard from other leaders is they want to make a change. They don't know how to do it ongoing. So I would just ask them, if you're a Black person and someone's asking you for advice on this topic, I would ask them back, what do you want to accomplish out of this? And I would put it back on them to have them say, hey, I want 10% of my organization. I want to do 20% of this, or let them feed back to you and ask them for that, and then say, all right, let's take it through. What's the next step you would do, in terms of doing that? And I think, I just think, Edith, if I think a lot of white people have the answers inside them, and they want, first of all, they want to make sure it's okay. So they.
Why do you say that? What do you mean by that?
Why they have the answers inside of them?
Yeah.
Because the reality is, Edith, that when people see things, the stuff that's been going on with the Black community, and I've seen this across the board with my friends that are conservative, liberal, across the board. A lot of people in leadership positions have kids, and I think when you look at these situations, if that were your child going through that, you would have a much different. If your kid got bullied at school and you were a parent, you'd be on the phone with the school, right? And so I think a lot of things that people see is when you see that happening, and then you start to look through the lens of your family, your child, your things. And some of the things I've been saying to leaders is, hey, what would you do? What would this phone call be if that was your kid? What would you be doing? By the way, your kid gets a bad grade in school and you go crazy helicoptering, in general. Imagine your kid coming home every day with the situations that you hear about when you read all these stories. You as a person, what you do. You would get in the car, you would pick up the phone, you would, do whatever you need to do. And I think that asking people back what they want to accomplish, like if they're upset,
right.
I just think it's really, I would ask them what do they want to accomplish and what actions they're willing to take. The other thing is, like, what are you willing to do? Like, this was an issue I've dealt with in this terms of the older generation versus younger generation, how fast to move. Like, are you willing as a leader to let some people let the ship sail? You're not targeting your improvements for the people at your institution or your friend group. You may not be targeting the group that's giving you pushback. Are you willing to let them go? And I think as a leader, those are decisions that you need to make. And that's why leadership's not easy, by the way, is because leadership, not everyone's happy all the time. But in this situation, you have to be principled, I think, about what you're trying to get to. And that principle has to override making people happy all the time.
Something you said was very interesting. You were saying that if there's something that's happening with your kid in your universe, in our universe, I would include myself in that, you get on it. And you make that call and you figure out, is this like a one-time thing? Is it structurally institutionalized challenges? As a person of color, as a Black person, you go into these conversations, one, with the advocacy question, and then you start thinking about, all right, how am I going to make sure that I'm not just advocating for my child, but I'm advocating for, really changing the environment so people realize that things are going on that like you don't even, it's not just about getting a great grade, although, we advocate for, mostly, I think I've advocated and put pressure on my kids, but we don't have time for that. But the reality is, we as a race are often in a position to self-advocate or not be seen or not be heard and not be promoted and not be paid in instances. And so I think an important takeaway here is that we've got to continue to advocate as we always have. So when we're asked to be in the room to talk about our experiences of Black, I think I said this already on this call, I've said to CEOs who are reaching out to their people broadly, I want you to make sure that you write down on your calendar this eye-opening conversation you've had with these 5 Black people, and I want you to make sure you're talking to them again in a month.
Yeah.
And I want you to make sure that when you talk to them, it's in not only about the experience of how to create an environment where everyone can perform, but also who they are, what they do, and get them involved in things that are important to you. So that's really key.
And Edith, just quickly, I think one thing is, I've gone through crisis before, and the one big crisis I went through, there were 2 people who called me. One was Howard Schultz and one was Ken Chenault. And I always think about that day, and I've said it both to Howard and Ken afterwards, that like those 2 phone calls probably meant more to me than anything on the planet. And I also think as a white person, when you see these issues, speaking up is is the most important thing. And it may not be comfortable, but the reality is one thing that will help the Black community is white people speaking on their behalf. And I think like one of the things I'm most excited about for your new business, frankly, Edith, is like you guys are creating a business where you're going to be able to give voices to people that they're not getting inside of their own companies or corporations in terms of training and learning. And I think about that from you guys are putting into a business, but in your everyday life as a person, if you see that stuff happening or see someone speaking up. I just went to a Black Lives Matter rally at Greenwich Academy, which you are a trustee of, and I'm a current trustee and the chairman of. And I think there were 9 girls or 10 girls that got up and spoke. And there was a Black trustee that got up and spoke. And I wasn't planning on speaking when I was there, but the history of like all the people that supported me, that I felt like if no one white gets up and speaks at this, what message does that send? And I think there's a lot of situations that white people are in where they may not feel comfortable, but being supportive means a lot. It means a lot to other white people, and I think it means a lot to Black people. But maybe I'm wrong. But
of course it does. Of course, we are. I'm certainly not going to speak for all Black people, as you are not speaking for all white people. But I would say that as human beings, it matters when someone actually realizes that how you are present in this world is relevant to other people. And, for so long, the challenges and the greatness of the challenges have been that it becomes something to fix. When I'm feeling now, as I've always felt, that this is an extraordinary opportunity for us as humanity to get better, bigger, and stronger. And you cannot do that if you are not including all the different constituencies of what humanity looks like today. I was in a conversation with the dean of Harvard College, who is a historian, and she was saying that she felt that now it is clear that people understand that inequality is not acceptable. It's 2020, and we're having an epiphany that inequality is not accessible. And so, but again, we could thrash people, we can, say that's horrible, but we could also recognize that progress means owning these different things. One of the things that's, I'd like to mention, there's someone who mentioned the significance of expanding the pipeline. We understand that talent exists in all places. Historically, Black colleges, HBCUs, have always been a critical center of gravity for educating people of color, and we often talk about the big ones, and I'm not going to mention them because there's some other big one that I'm going to miss. But someone shouted out Lincoln University, and I'll give a shout out to that because that's where my father and my uncle were educated, that positioned them to go forward. And so let's do that. Let's pay attention across the HBCU spectrum. Tim, what haven't we touched on? We have like a couple of minutes. The question that's a really hard question that you're like, she hasn't asked me that.
Well, I have a question for you, actually. We talked about this on the phone a couple of weeks ago or a week ago, I think is, I think you're in a unique position in many, many regards because of your background and all the things that you've done. And one of the things I had mentioned to you was kind of having like a Edith list. Like, you've gone through this situation, I think you've been amazing energy wise. I think you're going to be on a couple calls later today that I'm normally on that you're going to speak at also. And what for you as a person, what have you learned, and what are things that if you had a list of things you think would be helpful for everybody or helpful for white people, or what do you see as a list, a little simple list that's been most impactful for you over the last 4, 5, 6 weeks that's changed what would be different from this list versus your list from 2 years ago or 10 years ago?
Yeah, on my list forever, and will continue to be on my list, is that we all have to pay attention, and don't for a second believe that it's by natural excellence that senior ranks are held by white men, because it's not simply because it's not at all because the best rise to the top is because people paid attention. Their networks have been more robust. People looked at them as sort of, they looked at people and said, oh, that person's kind of like me, so I'm familiar with that. So you lean in on there, you're helpful, you give them that risk opportunity. So we really have to pay attention as people and as organizations to make sure that we really do have meritocracies. And because I'm confident if we actually do that, and that is really hard, we will see more Black people at most senior ranks, because I believe in our excellence. So that's first and foremost. Secondly, 4 years ago, when we had the last public uprising over killing Black people at the hands of police, I was at Goldman Sachs, and the internal conversation sounded something like, personally, I believe that this is an injustice, but as an organization, I'm not sure that we should really be talking about it. Comfort with talking about other things, but not comfort. Boy, have things changed. Yeah. So there's to be relevant as an organization, you have to be saying something. You have to be a human being as a CEO, and you have to be in touch with the reality of everyone's experience, not just the majority. But the second specific thing is hold yourself personally and professionally accountable for taking steps that are going to change. Right? It's going to take time is not a strategic priority. Yeah. We've tried, we're going to keep trying. The talent pipeline, all of those things sounds like you're like projecting it to someone else's challenge. In reality, when you as privileged people, you hold a tremendous amount of power. We've got to start to hold people accountable for understanding the privilege of power and disseminating that power more broadly. And so, listen, as always, we've run out of time. Pay attention, give access. I see that there. Annie Lou, thanks for sharing. I would like to comment that it is really important that we create these opportunities for community and dialogue, creating something whose mission is that. Medley is that. It's about creating groups of people with different perspectives led by expert coaching to help all of us figure this stuff out. Tim, thank you so much for joining.
Keep leading, Edith. You've got the best judgment on the planet. I've said it to you, and your judgment applied to this topic is really important. So I hope you keep going.
And it's really awesome to have you. I didn't have to read through my list and say, "Ooh, this is going to be hard for him," or "There's going to be," like, as always, you're in it and you're in the conversation, and we're going to continue to learn together. So thanks very much. Take care, everybody. See you next time.
See you guys.